Welcome to Conversations of Hope, a podcast that shines light into the darkness of childhood sexual abuse. I am your host, Faith Ingram of Speaking Truth in Love Ministries.
And I am Michelle Viscuse from Journey Pink. We are both survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and we're sharing our healing journey to raise awareness and provide hope and support to other survivors.
We know what it's like to feel all alone with our secrets, but we also know what it's like to find freedom. We are breaking the silence that allows sexual abuse to thrive and using our voices to empower and encourage those who have experienced abuse.
Our goal is to create a safe space for survivors to find hope and healing in community. Thank you for joining us.
The last several sessions, we've been talking about the impact that abuse has on survivors, and a lot of these impacts will last most of our lives. We can have healing, but we've talked about the mental, physical, and spiritual impacts that abuse has. And because abuse impacts our whole being, it also impacts our relationships with others. And the most important impact that it has relationship-wise is with those that are closest to us. And a lot of times we aren't even aware of the impact that what we went through as children has impacted our relationship with our mate especially, and our children. I remember when I told our children, our son was in college, and I had told him that his grandfather had molested our niece and that I had been molested by his grandfather when I was a child. And I remember him making the comment then, well, that explains a lot. My children didn't know of my abuse because I didn't think that it was important for them to know. I thought that me keeping that part of my life a secret from them would actually be better for them to not know what I went through, and it would protect them. I didn't realize that he had picked up on different things that I did and said and the way that I interacted with them, that he would say, oh, well, that makes sense now. He didn't elaborate on what I did, what made sense of what I did then. But I mean, it does impact our relationships. And the most important impact is our relationship with our spouse, because we become one. And whatever happened and impacts us, it bleeds over into our relationship with them. And I know that Michelle and I have different stories about when our husbands found out about our abuse. Dale and I were dating, and it was right around the time that we became engaged. We were on a date, and I was just in the car, and he went to put his arm around me, and I just could not handle it, and I just started crying and crying and crying, and I couldn't stop myself. And it's because I didn't trust men, and the physical relationship of just him putting his arm around me, or, it just got to the point where I just broke down, and he didn't know what was going on. And I finally was able to tell him I was abused by my dad, but I didn't go into any detail. And then, so he did know that I had been abused by my dad. And his thought at that point was, I don't want anything to do with your dad. And I said, well, we do need to love and forgive. So my dad ended up performing our wedding ceremony. And our relationship with my parents was like nothing ever happened. It was kind of like normalized, and we never talked about the past, although we tried to be very careful about letting our children be around my dad at all by himself. But that's all my husband knew. But then, because of my abuse, our physical relationship was impacted. I had feelings like, that's all guys want. It's selfish. You know, it's a selfish want on men's part, and they can't control themselves and all of this stuff. And that's going through my mind all the time, which has to impact your intimate relationship with your husband if you're thinking, well, it's just a selfish abuse thing instead of an act of love and affection. So that impacted me a lot. But my husband was very understanding, and he was always looking out for me and very protective of me.
When you mentioned, because we're one with our husband, I remember in my situation when I was in counseling for the first time, and I was explaining to my counselor how I'd been married for 13 years and my husband had no idea that any of this was part of my story, and there was no way that I was going to tell him, that it would destroy us, it would destroy our marriage, and it was not going to happen. Like, I was very firm that it's not going to happen. And she said, Michelle, you truly are not one with your husband because you're hiding this huge, significant part of your story from him. And I had to think about what she said and think about the reality that that's true. Like, this is a big part of my story. And here I am going to see a counselor to deal with it, and I still don't want him to know. And so she said, I'm going to pray for you to have the opportunity to tell your husband and to want to tell your husband, like, for God to make a way. And after that session, I started thinking about the possibility. What if I told him? What would that look like? How would it affect us? And of course, we talked a little bit before about how our minds overanalyze and want everything to be perfect. And then there's also the doomsday thinking. So I'm going through all the worst case scenarios that could happen. I mean, we would do that. I would do that over minor things. So something major like this would take a significant amount of energy to come to a decision. But what happened was I had a dream. It was a very, very vivid dream. And in that dream, I came home from work, and the dream was so vivid, I could see my husband standing at the counter crunching green peppers. I was cutting the peppers, he picked them up, and he was crunching them. And like, I could hear the crunch in my dream. Such a vivid dream. And the kids were playing. I could hear the boys in the living room, and I was like, where's Morgan? And he said, she went with him to the bridge. And I just dropped the knife in the sink, and I was like, why did you let her go to the bridge? And he's like, why wouldn't I let her go to the bridge? He wanted to take her to the bridge. And in that dream, it turned dark, and I'm pacing the house, and I'm still waiting for her to come home. And I am freaking out because I cannot believe that, this has happened. And she comes into the door, and I get down on my knees, and I take her face in my hands, and I said, are you okay? Did anything happen? And then I woke up. And when I woke up from that dream, it made me realize that I had to tell my husband, like, there's no way I can navigate this by myself. And there's no way I should be hiding this part of my life because it's so important that he know it. And so I wanted to wake him up at 2:00 in the morning and say, oh, by the way, let me tell you something. But I didn't do that, thankfully. I waited until my next session. But when I had my next session, I walked in and I was like, I am ready to tell my husband, and we need to set up a time to do it, because she had offered to bring him into the counseling session for me to share with him. I felt more safe and more comfortable doing that because I was afraid. I didn't know how he would react, but also didn't know how angry he would get or what he would do if he knew. And so I had already made my list of here's all the potentially terrible things that are going to happen because I'm going to tell him. So I felt like if I did it in counseling, then, I would have somebody with me and she could help structure it. And it ended up being a wonderful thing because we went to the session together and she prepared him by saying, like, what Michelle's about to tell you is really, really hard for her to say. And it's hard for her to even talk about. And so she helped prepare him to hear what I was about to say. And it was hard for me to even say it. And it took a minute, and she would just say, give her time. It's going to take a minute. But she definitely, I looked at her and I was thinking, like, will you just tell him? Will you just do it? But she wanted me to use my voice, and that was so important. And I remember, like, before the word ever left my mouth, my entire life is hinging on this moment. It's either going to be the worst thing or the best thing. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. And that's how overwhelming it felt to tell that secret to the man that I committed my life to. And so I said it. And then I sat there for a minute, like waiting for what's going to happen. And I could see the wheels in his head turning. Like when you said your son said, oh, now that makes sense. I don't think that's what Anthony said, but I could see the wheels in his head turning like, oh, now that makes sense. Like that's kind of what his reaction was. And he was very calm, and he was very careful to not respond quickly or anything. Like he would look at Deanna and say, so what should we do now? Or what is our next step? Or how can I help? So he was very calm about that. And I was afraid he would like blow up, and he didn't. And then I remember when we were leaving, it wasn't a long session. It was just a normal session. And, when we were walking out of the door, it just felt like this huge gulf of darkness that was between us was gone, because all of the truth was in the light then. And I no longer had to worry, is he going to find out? Is he going to know? Is he going to think terrible of me? Is he going to leave me? I didn't have to worry about those things anymore. I didn't have to make up alternative outcomes of what would ever happen if he found out. And also the fact that he was supportive and was kind and helpful was a huge part of my healing, because it undid some of the things that I felt about myself from a shame perspective and from a, if you really knew me, you wouldn't love me thought, because he did. He still loved me. Was it hard? Yes. And did that open up a whole nother set of complications for our marriage? Yes. But we were truly one in that moment. And now I know what she meant when she said, you're not one with your husband, because you're living with this huge, huge lie that part of your life you're hiding from him. And it's a huge part of your life. It's a significant part of your life that's caused you to stop what you're doing and to get help, because it's impacted you that much. And think of how it's impacting your marriage. And so I can honestly say that, since then, while it has not been perfect, we've had our ups and downs, and there's been times specifically dealing with the abuse and how it's affected our relationship or our marriage. There's been times where it's been hard, but at the same time, I'm so thankful that gulf of darkness is gone, and that we are truly one now, and that he not only listened and supported me and loved me, but has stood by me and has honestly, like, if anyone has encouraged me to speak up, it's him. From day one, he's like, you need to talk about this, and you need to tell, because it's a big deal. And so it's hard to talk about, but it's really important. And I know that sometimes people maybe have told their spouses and they didn't get the support or the encouragement or the love that they needed. And that's heartbreaking. But that does happen, and that is heartbreaking because you truly, when your spouse is telling you the most vulnerable part of their story, please listen. Please love them. Please encourage them. Please see that they didn't ask for this to be their story. No one asked for this to be their story. It took us 13 years to get there, but we got there, and it made a difference.
Yeah, and I think even though I did tell Dale before we were married, when you actually are that vulnerable, I remember we just went for a ride and we parked in an area where we wouldn't be bothered, and I just cried for probably half hour, 45 minutes. I just cried and sobbed, and because I had not told anyone before that time. And so he was actually the first person that I actually told. And it's very difficult to tell somebody that, like I said, I didn't go into any detail. I just said I was abused by my father, and I didn't give him any detail at all. And we never really talked about it during our relationship. He knew it was always an underlying issue, because we were talking earlier about the impacts. It does impact us, how we relate to one another and how we think and what our fears are and all of that. But it was good that he knew that right from the start, so that when I was struggling with things, he could kind of understand that. And like you were saying, there are people that when you're vulnerable like that, the safest relationship should be with your mate.
Mm-hmm.
And they should be the safe ones that you can go to, and they aren't going to use your background as a weapon. They aren't going to use it to manipulate you. There are people that are in relationships that aren't safe, that people will use their past as a weapon, and especially if it's abuse, you can't use that as a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
Abuse is something that is not the person's fault. They didn't choose to be abused. They didn't choose who their parents were. They didn't choose the people that they trusted and took advantage of them. They didn't choose to be taken advantage of. And all of us, I think nobody goes through life unscathed or without some type of trauma. So if you're in a relationship, you need to understand people's background and be there to support them and protect them and work together through whatever issues come up. If when they're struggling with things, you work out, okay, what can we do to overcome whatever issue that we have? And then, like in our situation, my dad, after we'd been married for years, my dad abused another relative in our family, and we had to deal with that as a family and together through the church and through the legal system. And that was a difficult time for our family. And I think all of our kids struggled because our youngest at that time was 11 and our oldest was 21. And it was that time they're like, oh, if this guy who says he's a Christian can act that way and do those things, then do I want to be a Christian? All of our kids went through that time and they're like questioning their faith, just like we talked about last time when we were abused. We questioned where God was and who he was and does he love us? Our kids were going through all of those questions because they just found out that my dad was an abuser. And it affects their relationship with God, not just my relationship with God was impacted, but their relationship, because now they're saying, okay, how can this happen?
Mhm.
And they're questioning a lot of things that I was questioning before. And I think even to this day, they still are questioning some of those things.
Right. Right. Because it challenges their perception of safety, and it challenges their perception of who is safe, right? Because up until a certain point, they thought that that person was safe. And so it's like a major bombshell for them to all of a sudden realize, well, if they're not safe, who else isn't safe? Like, what is safe? And again, I think having a sense of safety is so important. And this shatters that on all levels. Like, it shatters it for the person who's the victim. It shatters it for the surrounding family and family members. And it takes away the sense of safety. And I will say that, um, my husband got it right most of the time. There were a few times where, and I wrote a little bit about it in the book because I wanted to be transparent that, it wasn't perfect, and he didn't always say the right thing, but we were able to work through that. And sometimes you don't know, and therefore you say something that you don't realize might be hurtful or might be harmful, but it is never too late to go back to that person and say, I simply did not understand and I'm sorry. And that takes so much off of a victim. And so if you haven't responded maybe in the best way, it is never too late to go back and say, I'm sorry for how I responded, and I truly am sorry for what happened to you. I just didn't understand. Because because we don't talk about it, and it's not a topic that people generally discuss, you don't know. And what you don't know, you don't know. And so that's why we think it's so important to talk about it, so that people understand that this is what it's like. This is what it is like for a victim, and this is how they have to process things and how they live and what they struggle with. And again, it's different for everybody. This is just our story. Even our stories are different. Our struggles are different. But that is why we are sharing. Not because this is fun for us. This is hard. This is hard. But we think this education and knowledge is helpful. It's helpful for victims to know that they're not alone, and that we had these similar struggles. And this is how God brought us through, and this is how we were able to overcome. So that's why we share. And the best thing I think that you can do in a situation when your spouse or a person really close to you is about to share a really vulnerable part of their story is to listen. Sometimes there really aren't words, and maybe it's not the best time to ask questions. Like, why didn't you tell me? That's a very valid question. But when you say that in the moment, that also makes the victim feel bad, like they've done something wrong. They should have, I already feel bad. I'm telling you the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And now I feel guilty because you're upset that I didn't tell you sooner. And so sometimes the questions can just wait, and just being in that moment with that person and letting them know that you're there for them and you support them and that you're going to get through it. I remember Anthony saying, we're going to get through this. It's going to be fine. And nothing in me believed that, but I was happy that he thought that was going to be the case.
Right.
So, your marriage is important, and to truly be one, it is helpful. It is helpful for you to let those secrets out into the open, because it impacts your intimacy. It impacts your conversations, your connection, your relationships and friendships outside of the marriage. So it's really important to to let that into the light and let that be known and work
Right.
through it together.
Right. And like with your story, sometimes you do need somebody else to be there to be your support when you unload this your most vulnerable parts of your life that you never really wanted to have to tell anybody.
Right.
And like you were saying, when somebody is vulnerable to you and shares their trauma, whatever it is, with you, the most important thing that you can do is say, I believe you. Thank you for telling me. I love you, and God loves you. And because people that have gone through this trauma, they have such low self-esteem and they already feel like they're unlovable. And if they tell somebody these secrets that they've been keeping, then they aren't going to love them. They're going to hate them. They're going to think poorly of them because they already feel shame.
Yeah.
And another thing that we need to tell people is that it's not their fault. The abuse is never the fault of the victim. And we need to keep on reinforcing that because they still feel shame, even though it's not their fault. And they shouldn't feel that shame.
Right. That shame takes a while to work through. And
Right.
one more thing just to mention, because we are grown women telling you that when we open up to tell the most vulnerable part of our story to someone, what is helpful to hear back. But it's coming to my mind that it might be important to say, like if a child or, someone younger were to come to you and say something like that is happening, that's when you don't say things like, why didn't you tell me earlier? Or what are you talking about? When, again, listen, I believe you. Thank you for coming to me. Thank you for telling me that this is happening. I am here for you and I am going to help you. The questions can wait. Because again, I would shrink back if you came at me with why didn't you tell me? That automatically put me on edge. I shouldn't say anything else because you're mad at me and I don't want you to be mad at me. And so just to be aware that that's part of creating a safe space for people to share their story, is a space that lets them share the story. Sure, you're going to have questions in your mind, but that is not the time to, ask, why haven't you told me? Or why didn't you tell me? Or, so just to be sensitive to that and to create that space of safety. I found it in the counselor's office, which is why I brought my husband there. And wherever that is for you, have that space and let it out and find healing.
Right. And I think too, if it's a child and they're still in an abusive relationship, you need to report that.
Absolutely.
Don't tell her everything's going to be okay,
Right.
but say, I will walk through this with you and I will be here for you no matter what happens, because we don't know what's going to happen, but we can tell them that we will be there for them so that they know to trust us, and make sure that they do know that you believe them and that you're not shocked. Don't act shocked. But you shouldn't ask a lot of questions because when they are investigating a situation, if you muddy the water by asking a lot of questions that might steer them one way or the other, then you can actually muddy the water. So the best thing to do is let them talk to you, but don't ask a lot of questions. But then say, if it's something that needs to be reported, make sure that you report it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even before that, find out who you need to contact, where these people are, who are the helpers, make sure they're trauma informed, and walk that process out with that child. If you think it's hard for you to navigate, imagine what it's like for the child. So be their support, be there with them.
We hope this podcast is a source of comfort and inspiration for those who are struggling with the aftermath of childhood sexual abuse. Thank you for joining us on this journey of hope and healing.
Please be sure to subscribe and check out our show notes for more information. See you next time on Conversations of Hope with Faith and Michelle.